The cabin lights were dimmed just enough to let tired travelers rest, but not so dark that you couldn't see the person next to you fidgeting with their seatbelt or flipping through a magazine they weren't really reading. It was one of those long midday flights, routine, uneventful, the kind most people forget before their luggage even hits the carousel. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, smooth and blue, the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're floating in a quiet dream. Inside, the low hum of the engines mixed with the occasional cough, the rustle of snack wrappers, and the soft murmur of voices trying not to wake the person across the aisle. Near the middle of the plane, a little girl sat by the window, her forehead gently pressed against the cool glass. She was small for her age, with bright eyes that still held that wide-open curiosity the world hasn't yet dulled. Her grandmother sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other occasionally reaching over to tuck a loose strand of hair behind the girl's ear. They'd just come from a weekend visiting cousins, full of laughter, backyard games, and too many slices of sweet potato pie. Now they were heading home, both a little tired but content, wrapped in that quiet comfort only family can give. A few rows ahead, a man in his late 50s shifted in his seat. He'd boarded with a scowl already etched into his face, muttering about overhead bins and kids running wild. He hadn't smiled once at the flight attendants, just grunted when handed his drink. His name wasn't important. What mattered was the tension coiled inside him, the kind that doesn't come from the flight itself but from something deeper, older, uglier. He kept glancing back, his eyes narrowing each time the little girl moved, even when she barely did. At first, it was just a sigh when she adjusted her headphones, then a sharp exhale when she whispered something to her grandmother. To most passengers, it was background noise. To him, it was an offense. The girl, unaware of his stare, reached into her small backpack and pulled out a coloring book. She'd been working on it all weekend, filling each page with careful rainbows, smiling animals, and stars with too many points. Because why not? She picked up a pencil, the kind with a soft eraser on the end, and began shading in a butterfly's wing. Her movements were gentle, focused. But then, as she leaned forward to get a better angle, the pencil slipped from her fingers. It rolled silently across the narrow aisle and stopped right against the man's shoe. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he looked down. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he nudged it away with his foot. Not back toward her, but farther into the aisle like it was trash he didn't want near him. The girl hesitated. She glanced at her grandmother, who gave a small nod. "It's okay, baby. Just go get it." So she unbuckled her seatbelt, slowly, politely, and stepped into the aisle. She bent down, reaching for the pencil. Her hand was inches away when the man suddenly snapped. "Can't you teach your kid to keep her junk to herself?" He barked loud enough that nearby passengers turned. The grandmother stood up, calm but firm. "She didn't mean any harm. She's just picking up her pencil. She's making a mess," he shot back, his voice rising. "You people always—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the air changed. The words hung there, sharp and loaded, and everyone within earshot felt it, the shift from annoyance to something darker. The girl froze, still crouched low, her small fingers hovering over the pencil. Her eyes filled with tears, not because of the pencil, but because of the way he looked at her, like she was something dirty, something less. And then it happened, before anyone could react, before the grandmother could pull her granddaughter back. The man lunged forward and slapped the girl across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot in a library. Gasps. A woman covered her mouth. A man in a business suit stood halfway out of his seat. The flight attendants, who'd been preparing drinks in the galley, spun around instantly. The little girl stumbled backward, more from shock than force, her hand flying to her cheek. She didn't cry out, not right away. She just stared at him, wide-eyed, trembling, as if trying to understand how the world could turn so cruel in a single second. Her grandmother let out a choked sob and pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her like a shield. Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're okay? You're okay," but the man wasn't done. "She had it coming," he muttered, leaning back in his seat like he'd just swatted a fly. "Someone's got to teach him respect." That's when someone moved. 3 rows back, a man who'd been quietly reading a paperback suddenly closed his book and stood up. He wasn't loud. He didn't shout, but there was a presence to him, a stillness that carried weight. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. No flashy watch, no military patches, nothing to announce who he was. But the way he walked, calm, deliberate, eyes locked ahead, told a different story. He'd seen everything. From the moment the pencil rolled, he'd been watching. Not out of curiosity, but out of habit. Years of training of being the one who notices the flicker of danger before it ignites had wired him to pay attention. He'd seen the man's simmering anger, the way his knuckles whitened when the girl moved, the venom in his voice before the slap even landed. And now, he was done watching. He stepped into the aisle and moved toward the front without hesitation. Passengers instinctively made space, sensing something serious was unfolding. When he reached the scene, he didn't look at the crying child or the furious grandmother. He looked straight at the man who'd struck her. His voice was low, steady, but it cut through the cabin like steel. "You don't touch a child." "Not ever," the man scoffed. "Mind your own business." "I just made it my business," the newcomer said, standing just close enough to block any further movement, but not so close it felt like a threat. "You're going to stay in your seat. You're not going to speak to anyone, and if you so much as twitch toward that little girl again, we're going to have a much bigger problem." There was no anger in his tone, just certainty. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and what you're willing to do. The man in the seat shifted, suddenly less sure of himself. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in the other man's eyes shut him up fast. This wasn't some random passenger picking a fight. This was someone who'd faced down worse and won. A flight attendant finally reached them, her face pale but professional. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said to the newcomer. Though her voice lacked conviction, he didn't move. "Call the cockpit. Tell them we've got a passenger who assaulted a minor. They need to notify authorities at the destination." She hesitated, then nodded and hurried away. Meanwhile, another attendant knelt beside the grandmother and the girl, offering a blanket, a bottle of water, a soft voice saying, "You're safe now. We've got you." The little girl finally let out a quiet sob, burying her face in her grandmother's shoulder. Her cheek was red, but it would fade. The real wound was deeper. The sudden understanding that kindness isn't always returned, that sometimes cruelty comes without warning. But then she felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder. She peeked out and saw the man who'd spoken up. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "Hey," he said softly, "you didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing." She sniffled, looking into his eyes, steady, kind, full of quiet strength. "You're brave," he added. "Braver than most adults I know." She didn't say anything, but she managed a tiny nod. He stood back up and turned to the flight crew. "Move them to better seats." Away from him, the attendants didn't argue. They quickly found 2 empty seats near the front. First class, but no one cared about that now. As the grandmother gathered their things, the man stayed between them and the aggressor, a silent wall of protection. Once they were settled, he didn't follow. He returned to his original seat, picked up his book and sat down, but his eyes never left the back of the man's head. He wasn't reading. He was watching, waiting. The cabin slowly returned to a tense quiet. People whispered in hushed tones. Some shot angry glances toward the man who'd struck the girl. Others avoided looking at him altogether, as if acknowledging him might invite trouble. But no one defended him, not a single person. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the clouds. The plane cruised on, carrying its passengers through the sky, but everything had changed. What had started as an ordinary flight had become a moment that would stick with everyone on board. Not because of the violence, but because of what came after. The quiet courage of a stranger who chose to act when it mattered most. And in the front row, a little girl leaned against her grandmother, her breathing finally even, her eyes drifting shut, not because she was tired, but because for the first time since the slap, she felt safe again. The cabin settled into a strange kind of quiet after the little girl and her grandmother were moved up front. It wasn't the peaceful hush of people dozing off or lost in thought. It was the heavy silence that follows something wrong, something that shouldn't have happened. Everyone was still processing it. Some stared out the window, pretending to be absorbed in the endless blue, but their eyes were distant. Others kept glancing toward the back, where the man who'd struck the child now sat with his arms crossed, scowling like he was the one who'd been wronged. But the real focus of the cabin, though no one said it out loud, was the man in the gray t-shirt. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't made a speech. He'd simply stepped in, spoken calmly but firmly, and then returned to his seat like it was nothing. Yet everyone felt it, the shift in the air, the sense that someone was watching, ready. He wasn't showy about it. He just sat there, book open in his lap, but his eyes weren't on the pages. They stayed fixed on the man in the middle seat, sharp and steady, like a guard dog who'd decided this was his post now. A few rows behind him, a college student kept sneaking glances over the top of her laptop. She'd recorded the slap on her phone, not for clicks, not for drama, but because her hands had moved before her brain caught up. Now she wasn't sure what to do with the video. Should she post it? Send it to the airline? Delete it? She kept replaying the moment in her head. The crack of the slap, the girl's stunned silence, the way the stranger had moved like he'd done this 100 times before. She didn't know who he was, but she knew she'd sleep better tonight because he was on that plane. Up front, the flight attendants worked quickly but quietly. One brought warm towels and a cup of juice for the little girl. Another spoke softly into the intercom, relaying a coded message to the cockpit. The captain's voice came back a moment later, calm, professional, but the tension in his tone was unmistakable. They were now in contact with ground operations in Los Angeles. Law enforcement would be waiting, but the flight still had hours to go, and no one knew what the man in the back might do next. He'd started muttering again, low, angry words under his breath. At first, it was just grumbles about entitled kids and airline policies, but then it turned darker. He leaned toward the woman in the aisle seat and said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "You think I'm the bad guy? She disrespected me first. You people always play the victim." The woman didn't respond. She just turned her face toward the window and put her headphones on, even though they weren't plugged in. That's when the man in the gray t-shirt stood up again. He didn't rush. He didn't glare. He just rose slowly, tucked his book into the seat back pocket, and walked forward with the same quiet certainty as before. This time, he didn't stop at the scene of the slap. He kept going, straight to the man's row. He stood in the aisle, directly across from him. "You're done talking," he said, voice low but clear. "You've said enough," the man scoffed. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's seen what happens when people like you think they can hurt kids and walk away." That got a reaction. The man shifted in his seat, his bravado flickering. "I didn't hurt her. Just gave her a tap, a tap." The stranger's voice didn't rise, but something in it made the surrounding passengers lean back slightly. "You hit an 8-year-old girl because she dropped a pencil. That's not discipline. That's cowardice." The man's face flushed red. He started to stand, but the stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he took half a step closer, just enough to block any sudden movement. His posture didn't scream aggression, it radiated control. Like he'd been trained to handle exactly this kind of situation, and he knew every possible move before it happened. "I'm not looking for a fight," the stranger said. "But if you stand up, if you raise your voice again, if you so much as look toward that little girl, I will put you on the floor. And I won't ask twice. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise." The man sat back down, slower this time. His hands gripped the armrests, but he didn't speak. A flight attendant approached cautiously. "Sir, maybe you should return to your seat?" The stranger shook his head slightly. "I'm staying here." She opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it. She'd seen how he'd handled the situation. No yelling, no drama, just immediate, effective action. And honestly, she was relieved he was there. The airline's protocol was clear. De-escalate, contain, notify the captain. But protocols don't always work when someone's boiling over with hate. Sometimes you need a human barrier, someone who won't back down. So she nodded. "Okay, but if anything changes, let us know immediately." He gave a small nod in return. Then to everyone's surprise, he didn't go back to his seat. Instead, he took the empty middle seat in the row directly behind the man, the one that gave him a clear view of his head and shoulders, but also kept him close enough to react in a heartbeat. Passengers exchanged glances. No one said anything, but a quiet sense of relief spread through the cabin. It was like someone had turned down the volume on a storm. The danger hadn't passed, but it was being watched. Contained. Back up front, the little girl had finally stopped trembling. She sipped her juice slowly, her eyes drifting between the clouds outside and the kind flight attendant who kept checking on her. Her grandmother held her hand tightly, whispering soft reassurances. "We're going to be okay," she kept saying. "We're going to be okay." But the grandmother's eyes kept flicking toward the back of the plane. She didn't know the man in the gray t-shirt, but she'd seen the way he looked at her granddaughter. Not with pity, but with respect. Like he saw her as a person, not just a victim. That meant more than she could say. Meanwhile, the man in the back stewed. He tried to read a magazine, but his hands shook. He tried to close his eyes, but every time he did, he saw the stranger's face. Calm, unshaken, waiting. He'd expected outrage, sure, but not this. Not someone who didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't make a scene, but who made it absolutely clear that violence would not be tolerated. That kind of quiet authority was harder to fight. It left no room for excuses. An hour passed. Then another. The plane crossed state lines, the landscape below shifting from green hills to desert flats. The sun dipped lower, painting the cabin in warm amber light. Most passengers tried to rest, but sleep was hard to find. Too much had happened. Then, during a routine drink service, the man in the back suddenly stood up, head snapped toward him. The flight attendant froze, tray in hand. "I need to use the restroom," he said, voice tight. The stranger in the gray t-shirt stood instantly. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll walk with you." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're joking." "I don't joke about safety." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then the man muttered something under his breath and started down the aisle. The stranger followed 3 steps behind. Not close enough to seem aggressive, but close enough that there was no doubt. This wasn't optional. In the narrow galley, another flight attendant watched them pass. She gave the stranger a small, grateful nod. He didn't respond, but his eyes softened for just a second. The restroom door closed. The stranger leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the door. A few passengers watched from their seats, tense. What if the man tried something? What if he came out swinging? But when the door opened again, the man looked smaller. Defeated even. He walked back to his seat without a word, eyes down. The stranger followed, then resumed his post in the row behind. No one clapped. No one cheered. But you could feel it. The collective exhale of a cabin that had been holding its breath. Later, during a lull in the flight, the college student from earlier gathered her courage and walked back. She stopped a few feet from the stranger's seat. "Hey," she said softly. I wanted to say thank you." He looked up, surprised. "You don't need to thank me." "But I do," she said. I froze. Everyone did. "But you didn't. You saw what was happening and you acted. That little girl. She's going to remember that someone stood up for her." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was trained to protect people. But you don't need training to know that hitting a child is wrong. Anyone with a conscience would have done the same." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not everyone does." She walked back to her seat, feeling a little lighter. As night fell outside, the cabin lights dimmed again. The little girl was finally asleep, curled against her grandmother. The man in the back sat stiffly, staring at his tray table like it held answers. And the stranger in the gray t-shirt stayed awake, watching, listening, ready. He wasn't a hero in the flashy sense. He didn't wear a uniform or give interviews. He was just a man who'd seen something wrong and chosen to make it right. Not for praise, not for attention, but because it was the decent thing to do. And in a world that often feels too loud, too divided, too quick to look away, that kind of quiet courage mattered more than anyone could say. The plane hummed on through the dark sky, carrying its passengers toward the ground, toward justice, toward healing, and for the first time since the slap there was real hope that when they landed, things would be okay. Not perfect, but okay. Because someone had chosen to care. The night deepened outside the plane's windows, the sky turning from twilight purple to a rich, star-speckled black. Inside, the cabin settled into a fragile kind of calm. Most passengers had given up on sleep, but they kept their voices low. Movement slow, as if speaking too loudly or moving too quickly might stir up the tension that still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The man who'd struck the little girl hadn't said a word in over an hour. He sat rigid in his seat, eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. But everyone could feel it, the storm hadn't passed. It was just waiting. Up in the cockpit, the captain and first officer exchanged quiet words over the intercom. They'd been in contact with air traffic control and airline security since the incident. The decision had been made. They would not continue to Los Angeles. Instead, they'd divert to Dallas, close enough to land within the hour, far enough to ensure law enforcement could be ready on the ground. The captain keyed the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an onboard situation requiring immediate attention, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Dallas. We appreciate your patience and cooperation. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded knowingly. Others exchanged worried glances. But no one complained. No one argued. They all understood. This wasn't about inconvenience. It was about safety. About justice. Back in the middle of the plane, the stranger in the gray t-shirt heard the announcement and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Good. He'd been hoping they'd make that call. Keeping the man contained for another 2 hours would have been risky. People get tired. Attention slips. And even the calmest threat can turn dangerous when it feels cornered. He glanced toward the front where the little girl was now curled under a blanket, her breathing slow and even. Her grandmother sat beside her, eyes open, watchful, one hand resting protectively on the child's back. She caught his gaze and offered a quiet nod of thanks. He returned it, then turned his attention back to the man in the middle seat. That's when things shifted. The man suddenly unbuckled his seatbelt. Not dramatically. Not with a shout. Just a quiet click, and then he stood. The stranger was on his feet instantly. Where are you going? He asked, voice low but firm. To stretch my legs, the man said, though his eyes darted toward the front of the plane. You don't need to stretch your legs, the stranger replied. Sit back down. I'm not breaking any rules, the man shot back, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. You're not crew. You can't tell me what to do. I'm not telling you as crew, the stranger said, stepping into the aisle without blocking it completely, just enough to make his presence known. I'm telling you as someone who won't let you anywhere near that child again. So sit down. A flight attendant appeared at the edge of the galley, her expression tight. Sir, please return to your seat. We're preparing for an early descent, the man hesitated. He looked from the flight attendant to the stranger, then toward the front of the cabin where the little girl slept unaware. For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might push forward. His jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists, but then he exhaled sharply and dropped back into his seat, buckling the belt with more force than necessary. Fine, he muttered. But this isn't over. The stranger didn't respond. He just stood there for a few seconds longer, making sure the man wasn't about to bolt again. Then slowly he returned to his seat, but he didn't sit. He leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, posture relaxed but alert, like a sentry who knew the hardest part was yet to come. In the rows around him, passengers began whispering. A man in a baseball cap leaned toward his wife. You think he's military? Has to be, she whispered back. Look at how he moves. Like he's done this before. They weren't wrong. The stranger hadn't worn his past on his sleeve. But it was there, in the way he scanned the cabin every 30 seconds, in how he positioned himself to see exits and threats at once, in the calm certainty that came only from having faced real danger and walked through it. He'd served for over a decade, not for glory, but because he believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And right now, that belief was all that stood between a scared little girl and a man who thought cruelty was his right. As the plane began its slow descent toward Dallas, the cabin lights brightened slightly. Flight attendants moved through the aisles checking seatbelts, stowing loose items, their faces professional but their eyes heavy with the weight of what had happened. One of them paused near the stranger. We've got ground security on standby, she said quietly. Local police, too. They'll meet us at the gate, he nodded. Good, she hesitated, then added, we put in a call to child services, just in case they need to speak with the girl and her grandmother after we land. Smart, he said. They'll want to document everything. She gave a small, tired smile. You've done more than enough today, but... Thank you, really. He didn't say anything. He just gave a slight nod and turned back to watching. Down the aisle, the college student who'd recorded the incident quietly deleted the video from her phone. She'd thought about keeping it, as evidence maybe, or just to prove it really happened. But then she realized the authorities would handle it. The airline would investigate. The truth didn't need her phone to survive, and the little girl deserved privacy, not viral fame. So she erased it, feeling a strange sense of peace in letting it go. Meanwhile, the man in the middle seat began fidgeting again. He pulled out his phone, tapped at the screen, then shoved it back in his pocket. He kept glancing at the overhead bins, at the emergency exits, at the flight attendants, The stranger noticed it all. The signs were clear. The man was looking for a way out. Not just off the plane, but out of consequences that couldn't happen. The stranger walked forward again, not with aggression, but with purpose. He stopped beside the flight attendant near the galley. "If he tries to leave before law enforcement boards," he said quietly, "he'll bolt. He's scared now, and scared people do stupid things." She nodded. "We've already locked the rear exit. Only the front door will open when we land, and it'll be blocked by a jet bridge with officers waiting." "Good," he said again. Then after a pause, "But keep an eye on him during taxi. People get desperate in those last few minutes." "I will," she promised. As the plane descended through thick cloud cover, the engines shifted pitch, the cabin pressure changed, and ears popped. Outside, the lights of Dallas began to appear, tiny pinpricks growing into glowing grids of streets and buildings. The city looked peaceful from up here, safe. But the stranger knew better. Safety wasn't a place. It was a choice people made, every day, in small and big ways. When the wheels touched down, a collective breath seemed to leave the cabin. The plane rolled smoothly down the runway, slowing with quiet efficiency. Passengers stayed seated, no one reaching for bags or standing up. Everyone waited. Everyone watched. The jet bridge connected with a soft thud. The seatbelt sign remained on. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated until further notice. Law enforcement will be boarding shortly." Silence, then footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The kind that mean business. 2 police officers and an airline security agent stepped onto the plane. They moved with calm authority, scanning the cabin until their eyes landed on the flight attendant, who gave a subtle nod toward the middle of the plane. The stranger stepped aside as they approached. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. One officer leaned down to the man in the seat. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The man's face went pale. "For what?" "I didn't do anything." "You're being detained in connection with an alleged assault on a minor," the officer said evenly. "You'll have a chance to speak with investigators on the ground." "I want a lawyer," the man blurted, his voice cracking. "You'll get one," the officer replied. "Please stand up slowly and keep your hands visible." The man stood, shaking slightly. As he was led down the aisle, passengers avoided looking at him. No one jeered. No one cheered. There was no satisfaction in his shame, only relief that it was ending. When he disappeared into the jet bridge, a quiet sigh seemed to move through the cabin. It was over, but not quite. The officers returned a moment later. This time they walked toward the front. The grandmother tensed, pulling the still sleeping girl closer. "It's okay," one of the officers said gently. "We just need to speak with you both for a few minutes. Nothing scary. We want to make sure she's all right." The grandmother nodded, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Of course." As they spoke softly with the grandmother, the little girl stirred, blinking awake. She looked around, confused for a moment. Then her eyes found the stranger standing near the back. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. She didn't smile back, but she didn't look away either. In that look was something unspoken. Trust. The flight attendants began allowing other passengers to deplane row by row. Most moved slowly, lingering near the exits to make sure the little girl and her grandmother would be okay. The college student paused as she passed the stranger. "You're a good man," she said simply. He just shook his head. "I did what anyone should have done." But they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone does. As the cabin emptied, the stranger stayed until the very end. He waited until the grandmother and the girl were safely escorted off by officers and airline staff. Only then did he gather his small bag, sling it over his shoulder, and walk down the jet bridge into the bright, ordinary lights of the Dallas airport. No one clapped. No cameras flashed. No one even knew his name, and that was exactly how he wanted it, because for him, this wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure a child felt safe again. And as he walked toward baggage claim, just another traveler in a sea of faces, he knew that for tonight at least he'd done that, and sometimes that's enough. The Dallas airport at night was a strange mix of quiet and chaos. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, rolling suitcases clicking against tile floors, tired voices murmuring in a dozen languages. Most travelers hurried toward exits or gates, eager to get home, but near Gate B12, a small group moved slowly, deliberately. The little girl walked hand in hand with her grandmother, both wrapped in airline-issued blankets even though the terminal was warm. Beside them, two officers spoke in low tones, not with suspicion but with care. They'd already taken the initial statement on the plane, but now came the harder part, making sure the child felt seen, not interrogated. A woman from Child Protective Services knelt slightly as they reached a quiet corner near a closed coffee kiosk. She didn't pull out a notepad right away. Instead, she smiled gently and asked the girl if she wanted a juice box or a snack. The girl shook her head but didn't look away. That was progress. Meanwhile, across the terminal, the man who'd struck her sat alone in a small security office, his face buried in his hands. He'd been read his rights, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding room while detectives prepared to interview him. His phone calls, to a lawyer, to a brother, to no one who'd actually pick up, had gone unanswered. The reality was sinking in. This wasn't going away. What he'd done in a moment of anger was now a legal matter, a public record, a stain that wouldn't wash off with excuses. Back in the main terminal, the grandmother answered questions with quiet strength. She didn't yell. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. What happened. How her granddaughter had flinched every time a man walked past since the slap. How she'd held her close and whispered, "You didn't do anything wrong," over and over like a prayer. The officers listened carefully, taking notes, but their eyes kept returning to the little girl, who now sat curled in a chair, drawing on a piece of paper someone had given her. She wasn't drawing a monster or a courtroom or a jail cell. She was drawing a man in a plain t-shirt standing like a wall between her and something dark. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. To her, he was the person who made the bad thing stop. Hours passed. Statements were filed. Medical staff checked the girl for any physical injury. There was only a faint red mark on her cheek already fading. But the emotional toll? That would take time. The grandmother was given resources. A counselor's number, a victim support hotline, a voucher for a hotel near the airport since their original flight was long gone. She accepted them with gratitude, but what she really wanted was to get home, tuck her granddaughter into her own bed and hold her until the nightmares stopped. And then, just as they were preparing to leave for the hotel shuttle, she saw him. He was standing near a bank of payphones. Yes, they still existed, shoulders slightly slumped, looking more tired than heroic. He hadn't planned to stay. He'd given his statement to the airline security team, answered a few questions from the police, and was about to walk away. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't want attention. He'd done what felt right and now just wanted to disappear into the crowd like any other traveler. But the grandmother spotted him. She squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "Wait here a second, baby." She walked over slowly, her steps steady but her heart pounding. When she reached him, he turned, surprised. "You?" she said softly. "You're the one." He shifted, uncomfortable. "I just happened to be there." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You chose to act. That matters." He didn't know what to say. He looked down at his shoes, then back at her. "Is she okay?" "She will be," the grandmother said, her voice thick. "Because of you." When he hit her, I froze. Just for a second, but it felt like forever. And then you were there. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask questions. You just stood between her and him like it was the most natural thing in the world. He swallowed. It was. She studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the quiet strength in his posture. "Can I ask why you did it?" He thought for a long moment. "I've got a niece about her age," he finally said. "And I've spent most of my life trying to protect people who can't protect themselves. Today that was her." She nodded, tears welling but not falling. "Thank you," she whispered. Not just for stepping in, but for treating her like she mattered. Like she was worthy of protection just because she's a child, not because of anything else. He looked away, blinking fast. "Every kid deserves that." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind you get at hotels, and a pen. She wrote something quickly, tore out the page, and pressed it into his hand. "If you ever change your mind about staying invisible, we'd like to thank you properly. No cameras, no reporters, just us, and maybe a home-cooked meal." He stared at the paper. It was just a phone number and a first initial, no last name, no address. Just enough to reach out if he wanted to. "I don't need," he started. "I know," she interrupted gently. but we need to give it." He nodded slowly, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "All right," she smiled then, a real one, tired but warm. "Take care of yourself. You too," he said. "Both of you." She walked back to her granddaughter, who looked up from her drawing. "Who was that?" the girl asked. "The man who helped us," her grandmother said. The girl nodded as if that explained everything. Then she held up her drawing. "I made him a shield." Her grandmother's eyes filled again.
"He already had one," she said softly.
It was his heart. Later that night, in a modest hotel room 10 minutes from the airport, the little girl finally fell asleep in her own pajamas, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Her grandmother sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching her breathe, listening to the soft rhythm of her dreams. Outside, the city hummed with life, but in that room there was peace. Back at the airport, the stranger boarded a late-night shuttle to a rental car lot. He drove to a quiet motel on the edge of town, checked in under his real name, no aliases, no drama, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't scroll through his phone. He just sat there, replaying the day in his head. Not the slap, not the confrontation, but the moment afterward. When the girl looked at him and didn't flinch, that was the part that stayed with him. The next morning, he called the airline to confirm his rebooked flight. They offered him a first-class seat as a gesture of appreciation. He declined. "Just get me home," he said. He also checked the news. Local stations had picked up the story. Man arrested after slapping child on flight, but they didn't name him. The focus was on the victim, the response, the legal process. Good. That's how it should be. By noon, he was back in the air, this time on a nearly empty midday flight. He sat by the window again, book in hand, but he didn't read. He watched the clouds drift by, thinking about how fragile safety really is, and how powerful one person's choice can be. He didn't see himself as a hero. He'd done harder things in harder places, but this felt different, because it wasn't about training or orders or duty. It was about humanity, about seeing a child in pain and refusing to look away, and that, he realized, was something anyone could do. When he landed home, he went straight to his sister's house. She opened the door, surprised. "You're back early." "Yeah," he said, stepping inside. "Mind if I see my niece?" She smiled. "She's in the backyard, drawing butterflies." He walked out back and found her sitting on the grass, crayons scattered around her, tongue poking out in concentration. She looked up and grinned. "Uncle, look, I made you a picture." He sat beside her and took the paper. It showed a big man with a kind face standing in front of a tiny girl, both of them under a rainbow. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, it said, "My hero." He didn't correct her. He just hugged her tight and said, "You're my hero too." Because in that moment, he remembered why he'd always tried to be better, not for medals or praise, but for the quiet moments like this, where love and protection mattered more than anything. And somewhere far away, another little girl was sleeping soundly, safe in her own bed. Because one stranger chose to care, that was enough. More than enough. Weeks passed. The sky changed from summer gold to the soft amber of early fall. Leaves began to curl at the edges, and the air carried that crisp quiet that comes just before the world settles into winter. Life moved on, for most people at least. But for a few, the ripples of one moment on an airplane kept spreading in ways no one could have predicted. In a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a little girl sat at her kitchen table, crayons spread out like tools of a serious trade. She was working on a new drawing, careful, deliberate, her tongue poking out in concentration just like before. This one showed a plane in the sky, a tiny window with a girl looking out, and below her, standing on a cloud, a man in a plain t-shirt with his arms crossed like a guardian. She titled it in big looping letters, "My Angel on the Plane." Her grandmother walked in holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. She set one down beside the drawing and smiled. "That's beautiful, baby." The girl looked up. "Do you think he saw it?" "I don't know," her grandmother said gently, "but I think he'd like it." They hadn't heard from him since that night in Dallas. The number she'd given him stayed unused. No calls, no messages. At first she wondered if she'd overstepped. Maybe he really just wanted to walk away and never look back. But then she realized that was okay too. Some people help because it's who they are, not because they want anything in return, and that kind of quiet goodness didn't need a thank you to matter. Still, she kept the number saved, just in case. Meanwhile, the man who'd struck her faced consequences far beyond a slap on the wrist. His case made headlines, not because it was sensational, but because it was sadly familiar. People shared the story not to gawk, but to say, this shouldn't happen. Not ever. He was charged with assault and hate-motivated conduct. His employer let him go. Friends stopped returning his calls. In court, he tried to say it was just a tap, that he lost his temper, that kids these days have no manners. But the video from the airline's cabin camera, clear, unedited, undeniable, told a different story. The judge wasn't moved by excuses. He handed down a sentence that included community service, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order keeping him far from the girl and her family. Justice wasn't flashy. It didn't come with fireworks or speeches, but it came. And for the grandmother, that was enough. Back in another part of the country, the stranger in the gray t-shirt returned to his ordinary life. He fixed his neighbor's fence. He took his dog for long walks in the woods. He drank coffee on his porch at dawn, watching the mist rise off the fields. No one in his town knew what he'd done on that flight. He didn't tell them. He didn't need to. But one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. Not an email, not a text, but a real letter, handwritten on thick paper with a school logo in the corner. He opened it slowly, surprised. It was from a teacher at an elementary school. The letter explained that a student in their class had shared a story about a kind stranger who protected her on a plane. The class had been talking about courage, about standing up for others, and the girl's story moved them all. The teacher wrote, "We'd be honored if you'd consider visiting our school to speak with the students, not as a hero, but as someone who showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. We promise no cameras, no press, just kids who want to learn how to be brave." He read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and set it on his kitchen table. He thought about it for days. He'd never been one for speeches. He didn't like being the center of attention, and part of him worried that showing up would make it about him, when it had never been about him at all. But then he remembered the girl's eyes, how she'd looked at him not with fear but with something like hope. Maybe, he thought, this wasn't about him speaking. Maybe it was about listening, about showing kids that they too could be someone's shield. So he wrote back. Not a yes, not a no. Just, thank you for the invitation. I'll think about it. He didn't send it right away. He left it on the table for another week, letting the idea settle. In the meantime, the little girl started sleeping through the night again. She stopped flinching when strangers raised their voices. She laughed more, real, bubbling laughter that filled the house like music. Her grandmother noticed the change and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. One Saturday morning, they went to the park. The girl ran ahead, chasing pigeons, her shoes kicking up fallen leaves. A man walked past, tall, broad-shouldered, and for a split second the grandmother tensed. But then she saw the way he smiled at a dog, the way he held the gate open for an elderly woman, and she relaxed. Not every man was a threat. Not every moment had to be guarded. That was healing. Back home, the stranger finally mailed his letter. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He wrote, "I can't promise I'll come, but I promise I'll keep trying to be the kind of person your students should look up to, not because I'm special, but because we all can be." The teacher later told her class what he'd written. The kids didn't get disappointed. They got thoughtful. One boy raised his hand and said, "So, being brave isn't about being famous. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching." The teacher smiled. Exactly. Months later, on a cool November afternoon, the little girl's school held a small assembly about kindness and courage. There was no guest speaker, no grand event, just students sharing stories about standing up for a classmate, helping a lost kindergartner, saying no to a mean joke. And one girl, standing at the mic with her hands clasped tight, told the story of a man on a plane who didn't say much, but stood like a wall between her and harm. She didn't call him a hero. She called him the man who saw me. Afterward, her teacher found a plain envelope on her desk. Inside was a new box of crayons and a note that read, "Keep drawing. The world needs your light, no name. No return address." But she knew, and she smiled. As the year turned, the story didn't go viral. It didn't become a movie or a news special. It lived quietly, In classrooms and family dinners, in the way people now paused before speaking harshly to a child in public. It became a reminder that cruelty is loud but courage can be quiet, that one person's choice can stitch a tear in someone else's world. The stranger never visited the school, but he did start volunteering at a youth center on weekends, teaching kids how to tie knots, build simple shelves, stay calm under pressure. He never mentioned the flight. But sometimes when a child looked scared or unsure, he'd crouch down, meet their eyes, and say, "You're safe here." And they believed him. Years from now, the little girl would grow up. She might become a teacher, an artist, a counselor, someone who helps others feel seen. And if anyone ever asks her where she learned that kindness matters, she'll tell them about a gray t-shirt, a quiet voice, and a moment when someone chose to stand up instead of looking away. Because the real victory wasn't in the arrest or the headlines, or even the apology that never came. The real victory was in her sleeping soundly again, in her drawing rainbows instead of walls, in her knowing deep in her bones that she was worthy of protection, just as she was, and for the man who stepped in. He'd say he didn't do anything special, but those who were there know better. They know that in a world full of noise and fear, the most powerful thing a person can be is simply present and willing to act. No medals. No fame, just a choice, and sometimes that changes everything.